Good evening, everyone. Welcome to the 36th annual Paul V. McNutt Lecture, hosted by the History Department. I want to begin by thanking our donors who made this possible, those who provided funding to the History Department for the Paul V. McNutt Funds and other kinds of things we put on. And also this year, we also have support from the IDA, the Institute for Digital Arts and Humanities, and so I thank them for that support as well. I'm not going to introduce our speaker because Ellen will be doing that. But what I want to do is say, if you don't know who Paul V. McNutt is, I need to do that. I'm the historian that needs to tell you that he was a resident of Indiana, so he's a Hoosier. Grew up in Franklin, Indiana. He got his degree here at IU, got a law degree, and came back as a faculty member, ultimately rose to the deanship of the law school, and then became the governor of the state of Indiana in the 1930s, and then served in various roles in the Roosevelt administration. And so this lecture is in honor of him, and it's the 36th one. And without further ado, I'll hand you over to Ellen Wu, who's a faculty member in the History Department. She's a U.S. historian. She also knows Nicole, and that's why I've given this honor to present her. And so, Ellen, please come up.
Good evening, everybody. It's delightful to see all of us gathered here tonight who share a curiosity about the political history of the United States. The study of U.S. political history has seen a dynamic surge of energy in recent years, so much that historians working in the trenches refer to it as the, quote, new political history. Practitioners of new political history have been revisiting the familiar ways that we've narrated this country's past, asking different questions and focusing on actors who have been previously overlooked and underestimated. We are infusing traditional subjects such as elections, parties, rulers, governance, presidential administrations. We're infusing them with methods and preoccupations of social history, that is ordinary people, and cultural history, beliefs, ideas, and expressive practices. New political history is skeptical about the usefulness of binary divisions and labels that both historians and Americans in general commonly use to talk about politics, past and present. So red, blue, rural, urban, liberal, conservative, left, right, majority, minority, rise, fall, domestic, foreign, us, them, the list goes on and on. New political history, like Zoom options, electric vehicles, or cutting-edge fashion, is hybrid and non-binary. It's not afraid to look for the gray areas, the in-between stuff. New political history recognizes that people and institutions exercise power in ways that are messy, complicated, sometimes unexpected, and often resulting in unintended consequences. Ultimately, new political history is hopeful. Its scholars and teachers are committed to a nuanced, careful understanding of this nation's history as a way to think deeply about the workings of democracy in the United States. And in this way, historians are not only looking backward, we study the past with an eye towards our shared future because so much is at stake. Now, Dr. Nicole Hemmer, our McNutt lecturer this evening, who is actually a born and bred Hoosier, born and raised in Evansville, stands as one of the shining stars of the new political history. She is Associate Professor of History and Director of the Carolyn T. and Robert M. Rogers Center for the American Presidency at Vanderbilt University. She is author of The Rights, Conservative Media, and the Transformation of American Politics, which came out from Penn in 2016, and Partisans, the conservative Republicans who remade American politics in the 1990s, which just came out last year on Basic Books. Notably, Dr. Hemmer's research and writing reaches far beyond the ivory tower. She is one of the most engaged public-facing historians today, writing and podcasting about U.S. politics through outlets. In 2017, she co-founded Made by History, which was the Washington Post's historical analysis section, which is now hosted by Time Magazine Online. And she is co-host of the podcast This Day in Esoteric Political History, and also Past Present, which I highly recommend. I just listened to an episode on the history of the TED Talk. And she's currently a columnist for CNN. Tonight, Dr. Hemmer will be speaking on, and here's another Indiana reference, if you know Axl Rose, Guns N' Roses, Gender and Radicalism in the Post-Reagan Right. So without further ado, please join me in welcoming Dr. Nicole Hemmer.
Thank you so much for that lovely introduction. It is really nice to be back in Indiana. I'm not too far away from you all now down in Nashville, but it's always great to be here in the fall as the leaves are turning. So thank you so much for having me. So I'm going to start in November of 1990. That was the month that Boston Globe journalist Derek Jackson wrote a column on the upcoming election for Massachusetts governor. Surveying the field, he seemed to have surprised even himself by calling for the election of Bill Weld, a Republican. As a Black American, he wrote, he had little love for Weld or the Republican Party. In the column, he even calls Weld dangerous. But he found the Democrat, John Silber, even worse, a vector of nativism, racism, and sexism. He concluded, instead of providing an enlightened vision of a Massachusetts without petty fear and bigotry, Silber aimed low and stoked the angry white male vote by hoisting up the Bush-Reagan dartboards of welfare, Black drugs, and bitchy women. Weld would go on to win the election, ending 20 years of Democratic dominance in the state. But that's not why Jackson's column mattered. It mattered because it marked the first time that the phrase angry white male appeared in US newspapers. Within a few years, it would be popping up everywhere. So much so that the idea of the angry white male would become one of the central political archetypes of the 1990s. Now, to be clear, the 1990s were not the first decade that saw angry white men. Even the specific anger Jackson was pointing to was by that time a few decades old. By the 1970s, there was a clear cohort of white men who believed that the economic shifts, liberation movements, and affirmative action had all contributed to a genuine loss of both resources and cultural status. But it was in the 1990s that those white men got noticeably angrier and increasingly aligned with the Republican Party. Years of even more economic decline, plus right-wing political organizing, had sharpened white men's rage. And journalists were paying attention, finding the angry white man, listening to Rush Limbaugh's radio show, attending Pat Buchanan's campaign rallies, and enrolling in local militias. But we miss something when we talk about the angry white male of the 1990s. And what we miss are the women. Women were some of the most important conduits of right-wing radicalism in the 1990s. They served as translators and legitimators of male anger. But perhaps more importantly, they were part of a broader woman-led anti-feminism that helped define this new conservatism, a right in which women had far more power, but which was also far sharper in its opposition to feminism. So these women anti-feminists of the 1990s are who I'm going to talk about tonight. But before turning to them and talking about their work, I want to take a step back to talk about why all of this matters. What was happening in the 1990s, how the right radicalized and brought the Reagan era to an early end. So something critically important happens in US politics, particularly on the American right in the 1990s. The 1980s had been a boom time for conservatives. Ronald Reagan was elected in back-to-back landslide elections, and then his vice president won in a landslide election of his own. And then, in 1989, just after Reagan left office, in a moment few people expected, the Berlin Wall came down, marking the beginning of the end of the Cold War. It seemed in many ways the right had gotten everything it wanted. By 1992, conservatives had held the presidency for 12 years and witnessed the defeat of their greatest geopolitical enemy. And they were furious. A decade of unprecedented popularity for their movement had not transformed the country in the ways that they had wanted. Instead, conservatives discovered building and maintaining national majorities required compromise. Such compromises were anathema to a conservative movement that was increasingly concerned with political purity and partisan warfare. A right-wing populist insurgency was bubbling up, one which rejected the politics of both President Bush and President Reagan. And nearly as soon as Reagan left office, his influence on his party began to wane. Leading figures on the right began rejecting core parts of his politics. That's because Reaganism, the label given to his political and rhetorical approach as president, which was born in the Cold War, could only exist in a Cold War context. So it should come as no surprise that when the Cold War ended, the right left Reaganism behind. Except, of course, that comes as a huge surprise. If you think about the right today, you do not think about the end of the age of Reagan. You think about Reagan looming large at least until around 2015, 2016. Reagan looms so large in the conservative movement and mythology that it has been difficult even for historians to notice his eclipse. In fact, historian Sean Wilentz named the stretch of decades from the mid-1970s to the mid-2000s the age of Reagan, and many other historians have agreed. I'm not one of those historians. I would revise that just a little bit. By making Reaganism and conservatism synonymous, what we miss is how radically the right changed in the 1990s. The Reagan myth would grow in those years, but many conservatives would become Reaganites in name only. So, why did a significant portion of the right leave Reaganism behind? And what did they leave in its wake? Well, first of all, the Cold War was absolutely a major factor. Ronald Reagan was a Cold War president who preached Cold War conservatism. His beliefs were conditioned by the Cold War. The Cold War shaped, for instance, the centrality of democracy to his rhetoric as president. Now, embracing democracy was pretty easy for Reagan. He could look at his landslide elections and say, you know what? Majorities have it right. They know what's going on. He laced his speeches with appeals to democracy, presenting it as the antithesis to communism. The Cold War also conditioned Reagan's support for certain policies. He saw things like free trade, open immigration, and global engagement as an answer to the closed systems of communism. This is why he supported, for instance, the North America Accord, which was a precursor to NAFTA. It was an open trade and immigration zone with Mexico and Canada. And this is also why his his rhetoric on immigration was so welcoming. He believed that open systems, open borders, open movement of people was part of an open world. And while Reagan had opposed the major civil rights legislation of the 1960s and developed policies that disproportionately harmed Black Americans, he still managed to embrace diversity and equality as positive political values. With the end of the Cold War, all of that logic fell apart. A new set of right-wing politics emerged, one in which the actors felt no need to embrace democracy or diversity or international engagement. And this is the new right of the 1990s that I want to talk about tonight. I point out all of these features of Reaganism not to rehabilitate Reagan's reputation, but rather to show how quickly right-wing politics were shifting in the 1990s. When it came to democracy, when it came to immigration, right-wing populists in the 1990s had a very different vision for the United States. It's in the 1990s that you see the rise of politicians and pundits who are skeptical of the value of democracy. And Pat Buchanan, who would run for president in 1992, and 1996, and 2000, he talked about in 1991, so just as soon as the Cold War is coming to an end, now that we've defeated communism, we need to start rethinking this whole idea of democracy. I mean, what is better run? The federal government or the Marine Corps? The one that's run on more authoritarian principles. So if we want good government, maybe we should have something that looks a little bit more like that. The same decade saw the rise of a new anti-immigration movement and the return of America First politics. And when we take this all together, we can see that the 1990s, so often described as an era of intense political polarization, was actually a decade of right-wing radicalization. The Democratic Party didn't move left in the 1990s. It moved to the right on a wide swath of issues, on things like crime, on things like immigration. But the Republican Party moved even further right, adopting what were once far-right positions on issues like guns and immigration. Now, when people think about the right in the 1990s, this new right, there are a few common figures who emerge. You'll recognize a lot of these. Newt Gingrich, who would go on to become the first Republican Speaker of the House in 40 years. Rush Limbaugh, a wildly popular right-wing radio host. Pat Buchanan, who I just mentioned, a hard-right presidential candidate. And if you're trying to think of the whole scope of the right in the 1990s, you would also need to include Timothy McVeigh, a terrorist who blew up a federal building in Oklahoma City. You can't tell the story of the 1990s right without these figures. They're all important to that story. But if we focus just on them, we are left with the mistaken impression that the story is fundamentally about angry white men. But there were angry white women too, and they played a pivotal role in radicalizing the right in the 1990s. And they did this as part of a broader anti-feminist movement that was coming together in new ways in the 1990s. And that movement included the women that I'm going to talk about tonight, but it also included some other strands of anti-feminism: men's rights activists, conservative evangelical Christians. Men's rights activism had been around for a while. It had been around since at least the 1970s. But in the 1990s, it took a sharp turn toward a more explicitly anti-woman politics. That new men's rights politics was exemplified by the 1993 book, The Myth of Male Power by Warren Farrell. You can probably guess the argument from the title, but he was indeed arguing that men were systematically disadvantaged and powerless in the United States, that we'd all gotten it wrong, that things like rape laws needed to be repealed because they were weapons in the hands of women against men. White evangelical Christian women as well, including groups like Concerned Women for America, continued organizing around traditional gender roles in a way that had become more visible in the 1960s and 1970s. So there was this new religious right. There were these women at the forefront of it who were arguing for traditional values, for traditional gender roles. But these two groups tended not to dominate the anti-feminist discourse of the 1990s, in part because people were a little wary of them. Here are women calling for other women to go back into the kitchen. Here are men saying that rape laws should be repealed. That didn't resonate with a wide swath of Americans. But this new group of non-traditional women anti-feminists thrived in the decade. They were able to do so for a number of reasons that we'll talk about, but one of the big reasons was the particular media environment in which they operated. A media environment fascinated with the politics of contradiction. So men wielding firearms, that was something you might expect, but women doing so, that was intriguing. Men arguing against sexual harassment policies were retrograde. Women arguing against them was novel. Like male pundits and politicians, the more outrageous and radical women anti-feminists seemed, the more of a platform they gained. But unlike men, their radicalism was presented as amusing, harmless, a novelty, making it all the more palatable. So to understand these women of the 1990s, we have to take a moment to look at the anti-feminist women who came before them. In part because for some people, anti-feminist women can still feel like a bit of a contradiction. The most important of these women were housewife activists in the 1960s and 1970s. And I say housewife activist not because these women primarily worked raising families. A number of them were professional political operatives, but because that's how they styled themselves. So it's women like Phyllis Schlafly, who fought against the Equal Rights Amendment, Anita Bryant, who fought against gay rights, Louise Day Hicks, who fought against school desegregation. All three of these women positioned themselves as mothers protecting children and other women. They may have been active in the public sphere, but they used the home and notions of motherhood as the source of their authority. We know about children, we know about schools, we know how women should be because we are mothers. In Schlafly's case, this identity was deliberately developed in response to second wave feminism. She rejected women's political and economic equality with men, and also rejected women's liberation from traditional gender expectations around work, appearance, and sexuality. Feminism, Schlafly argued, did not rescue women. It harmed them. Equal rights meant loss of privileges. Women would be drafted into the military. They would lose their rights to alimony payments. They would no longer be covered by protective labor legislation. So that's what women anti-feminists looked like in the 1960s and 1970s. The women anti-feminists of the 1990s are very different. Women like Ann Coulter, Laura Ingraham, Kellyanne Fitzpatrick, all very popular pundits in the era, had absorbed the victories of the feminist movement. They built ambitious careers as lawyers and lobbyists and writers. They wore power suits and miniskirts. They worked in white shoe law firms and clerked for Supreme Court justices. Like Schlafly and other Cold War anti-feminists, the core of their politics was reactionary. But they organized not in revolt against second wave feminism, but against third wave feminism, particularly its concerns with sexual harassment, inclusive language, and gender-based legislation like the Violence Against Women Act. And rather than arguing that they were protecting other women, increasingly, they argued that they were protecting men, feminism's true victims. Take, for instance, the Independent Women's Forum, which would become the main organization for women anti-feminists in the 1990s. It begins in 1991 as the ad hoc group Women for Judge Thomas. Women for Judge Thomas was created by a group of women who were mostly friends and former clerks of Clarence Thomas. They sought to counter women's groups who opposed the conservative judge's Supreme Court nomination. They became much more important after Anita Hill came forward to testify that Thomas had sexually harassed her. They believed that as women, they could be an effective counterweight to Anita Hill's testimony. And in many ways, they were. In the years that followed, the group broadened its mission to act as a counterweight to liberal feminism and renamed itself the Independent Women's Forum. It was a pretty small group. It had about 600 members. But thanks to really favorable media coverage, it became the go-to counterpart for the National Organization for Women, the liberal group with hundreds of thousands of members. So one has 600, one has hundreds of thousands, but when journalists talked about feminism and anti-feminism, they would talk about the IWF as the counterpart to NOW, basically putting them up on the same plane. It suggested that IWF had a stature and influence far beyond what it had actually demonstrated. This is what happens when you engage in that kind of both sides journalism. But I want to tell you about one of the leading women who come out of the IWF in the 1990s, one of the leading right-wing anti-feminists of the decade, Laura Ingraham. After appearing on the cover of the New York Times Magazine in a leopard print miniskirt, she quit her job at a high-powered law firm in order to work full-time in media. Anti-feminism was the core of her brand. She did things like attack the Violence Against Women Act, saying that it was a useless bill that just played on people's emotions because it had this tearjerker name. She insisted that when women complained about their meager paychecks, the problem wasn't pay inequity, it was that taxes were too high. She testified before Congress against sex-based preferences. She also argued that those who opposed equality were actually its real defenders. And this is what she wrote for the New York Times. Aside from being patronizing and simplistic, the idea that women are constantly thwarted by invisible barriers of sexism relegates them to permanent victim status. It also stands on its head the cause that true feminists originally championed: equal opportunity for all. In other words, anti-feminists were the true feminists. Now, when I described Laura Ingraham, I mentioned that she wore a leopard print skirt on the cover of New York Times Magazine. And I mentioned that for a reason. It's an item of clothing that you would find referenced in just about everything written about Laura Ingraham in the 1990s. And I think that that actually matters. It matters what she wore on the cover of New York Times Magazine. The women of IWF blended their anti-feminist politics with an overtly feminine style, not the house dresses of an earlier era of activism. She doesn't look like Phyllis Schlafly, but rather a self-consciously youthful appearance that leaned heavily on sex appeal. So there's another woman on this cover. It's a little small, but you can see her back there. That's Lisa Schifrin, who's a former speechwriter for Dan Quayle. So she also appears on this cover, and you can't quite see her outfit, but she too is wearing a leopard print skirt, although hers is a knee-length pencil skirt paired with a blazer. But the reason why they chose these outfits, which were more risque than they are today, as one publicist who worked for a few IWF personalities explained, these women understood that they needed to be, as she put it, provocative. They needed to push buttons. They needed to be sexy in order to get attention. Now, the word provocative has two meanings: triggering outrage and triggering arousal. Right-wing men in the 1990s relied only on that first one. But women on the right leveraged the full range of the word, knowing that by leaning into their sex appeal, they were upending expectations. Because even in the post-Reagan era, conservatism had a pretty staid image. It was a little square. Especially when it came to women, the image of Republicans was pretty prudish. Women who were part of groups like Concerned Women for America embodied this style. They opposed wearing revealing clothes. They opposed sex outside of marriage or conversations about sexuality. They opposed suggestive songs and images. Not so for the women of the IWF. Many of them, including the ones I mentioned earlier, Ann Coulter, Laura Ingraham, Kellyanne Fitzpatrick, they became cable stars in the 1990s. As white women with blonde hair, bare legs, and a tendency to say the most shocking thing they could think of when in front of a microphone, these women embodied what observers called conservative chic. It was a style that would come to define outlets like Fox News in the years that followed. And it came at a cost. Political journalists wrote lasciviously and dismissively of these women, using insulting descriptors like pundits instead of pundits, calling them ignorant pixies. One male journalist described Coulter as a conservative pinup girl. He went on to write, "She's got the tight sweaters of a starlet, the long legs of a tennis star, the tumbling blonde hair of a cheerleader, and a hard-edged prosecutor's mind." And they don't write about Pat Buchanan that way. Though the women of the IWF tended to dismiss complaints about sexism as encouraging women to see themselves as victims, they pushed back against this kind of sexualization when it helped them score political points. When journalist Fred Barnes held up Ingram as an example of the young pundits making the rounds on television without the requisite experience or knowledge, Ingram shot back with a response that may have caused some to wonder just how much of an anti-feminist she was. "It's not like I showed up blonde and in a miniskirt and said, 'Hire me.' I clerked for a Supreme Court justice." She continued, "Those old white males don't speak to a lot of America. What does Fred Barnes know about my world? You don't hear male anchors and reporters being criticized for being too good looking." Responses like these made clear that these women anti-feminists had not rejected feminism entirely. In fact, with their law degrees, sexual freedom, high-powered careers, and arguments against male sexism, they were some of the greatest beneficiaries of second-wave feminism. So these anti-feminist women that I've talked about so far were not just pundits and activists with the IWF. They also had representation in Congress. Most significantly, in one of my favorite characters from my recent book, Helen Chenoweth. Helen Chenoweth was elected to Congress as a representative from Idaho in 1994 during the Republican wave in that year's midterm election. One of the few Republican women in the new freshman class, she would become known as one of the most radical members of a radical Congress and a spokesperson for the angry white male of the 1990s. Chenoweth was particularly concerned with the white men of the Northwest and the way environmental legislation threatened jobs like logging, grazing, and farming. She traced her political origins to the 1964 Wilderness Act, a piece of legislation that designated millions of acres of Western land as wilderness. That designation, she argued, sharply limited the logging, grazing, and mining that could be done on those lands, which she saw as a direct attack on both the economy and the culture of the West. It was when she decided to run for office in 1994 that she shifted men to the center of her analysis. On the campaign trail, she wore a t-shirt with a picture of a male farmer and a cowboy and the words, "Idaho's endangered species." Elsewhere on the clear, she declared more fully, "It's the Anglo-Saxon male that's endangered today." With rhetoric like that, Chenoweth quickly became the face of a movement symbolized by men and masculinity: cowboys, loggers, ranch hands, miners. It wasn't that only men held those positions. Chenoweth organized women ranchers and loggers as part of her campaign. But the face of these industries had long been white men. That was true for something called the Sagebrush Rebellion, a movement that developed in the 1970s. The Sagebrush Rebellion was an effort to open up federal lands and roll back environmental regulations. It captured the attention of Ronald Reagan, but kind of fades out about halfway through his presidency. But while the movement faded, the anger in the West did not. In the 1990s, it came roaring back as the War on the West, a more militant and better funded movement, now amplified through right-wing talk radio and advocates like Chenoweth in Congress. Chenoweth, though, is interesting. She doesn't sound angry in most of her comments. Her rhetoric was outrageous rather than straightforwardly enraged, dripping with satire and mockery. She would hold endangered salmon bakes on the campaign trail to make a mockery of the Endangered Species Act. She insisted on being called congressman instead of congresswoman. Now, this was partly a jab at feminists who lobbied for more inclusive language, but it was also threaded through with a light feminist critique of its own. In an interview on Pat Robertson's 700 Club, she claimed to use the title because congressman commanded respect in a way congresswoman did not. Co-opting feminist language and arguments turned out to be a pretty popular technique among anti-feminist women. They particularly enjoyed using it to promote right-wing policies. Unlike conservative evangelical women, they didn't focus on the issue of abortion. In fact, we can talk about this later if you want, in the 1990s, there's some real wishy-washiness on the right around the issue of abortion. But where they were not wishy-washy was the issue of guns. Gun regulation had become a national political issue in the early 1990s in a way that it never had before. Two pieces of legislation would focus attention on the issue: the Brady Handgun Violence Prevention Act, which required background checks and a waiting period for gun sales, and the 1994 federal assault weapons ban, which prohibited some semi-automatic weapons and large capacity magazines. It was in response to these two pieces of legislation that the gun debate in the United States polarized, when it was turned into both an absolutist cause, I have a right to guns, an individual right, and a partisan one. This is the moment when this becomes a Republican issue rather than a bipartisan one. And as this happened, it puts Ronald Reagan at odds with his party. Reagan came out in support of both of these bills. Here he is writing in the New York Times in 1992, explaining why he supported the Brady bill. And you can understand why Reagan would support the Brady bill. It's named after his assistant, who was not killed, but pretty mortally wounded in the assassination attempt against Reagan in 1981. But he also supported the assault weapons ban. The National Rifles Association came out against both. And in that fight, the NRA won the soul of the Republican Party. And it's in this moment that the NRA shifts most of its funding to Republicans, and when it increasingly targets Republican primaries in order to ensure pro-gun legislators dominate the GOP. The gun debate was not just about right of access to guns. It becomes a cultural issue as well, and it becomes an issue in which the women of the IWF and these other women anti-feminists are very active. They are going to present gun rights and gun ownership as a more legitimate form of feminism than, say, legislation to prevent rape and domestic violence. Chenoweth played with this language in her push for unrestricted access to guns. In the mid-1990s, she proposed repealing a law that prevented people convicted of domestic violence from owning guns. Now, this was something that could easily harm women. And Chenoweth deflected from that by holding a press conference that featured women gun activists. And this included the president of Women Against Gun Control, whose motto was, "The Second Amendment is the Equal Rights Amendment." In other words, women did not need a constitutional guarantee of equal rights. To be equal to men, they just needed equivalent firepower. A similar dynamic played out in the way Ingram and other IWF members talked about issues like gun rights. So this is Ingram writing in the Wall Street Journal in 1996. In this piece, Ingram argued, Smith & Wesson and the National Rifle Association are doing more to take back the night than the National Organization for Women and Emily's List. You want to be defended against rape? You don't give money to liberal feminist organizations. You go out and you buy yourself a gun. She also suggested that real feminists would support women arming themselves rather than relying on predominantly male police departments for protection. No damsels in distress here. She ended the column with a call for more women to take up arms. That led a few months later to an event at a Maryland gun range called Annie Get Your Gun Permit. There, IWF members like Ingram and Coulter and others practiced skeet shooting in front of journalists who eagerly covered the event. In addition to calling for gun deregulation, women like Chenoweth made common cause and political connections with the most avidly pro-gun constituency in the country, the militia movement. The militia movement grew rapidly in the 1990s. It was made up of armed groups who ran drills and practiced for an imminent revolution. For some, this was a revolution against government and federal agents. For others, it was a race war. And here I just wanted to note that while militias were seen as one of these key spaces for the angry white male of the decade, about a third of militia members were women, 20 to 30%. And these militias shared a belief in common with the political right that the US government and supranational organizations like the United Nations were preparing to strip Americans of their sovereignty. And notably, many of these militias start organizing at the end of the Reagan administration because they think Reagan hasn't done enough to protect them. Reagan may have declared that government was the problem, but for the militias, government was the enemy. Militias were attracted to Chenoweth for more than just her advocacy of guns. In Congress, she would embrace many of the militia movement's theories and conspiracies about government. She spread conspiracy theories about black helicopters and the United Nations taking over the country's national parks. She promoted the sovereign sheriff's movement, which argued federal agents had no legitimate power, not explicitly granted to them by local sheriffs. And because of all of these actions, a local newspaper dubbed her the poster child for the militias. And the militia movement agreed. And the militia of Montana, one of the most notorious of the era, issued a catalog that sold VHS tapes of her speeches next to bomb-making manuals. And while Chenoweth distanced herself from the most overtly violent parts of the movement, she held that militias were noble and legitimate organizations. Chenoweth wasn't the only advocate of militias in Congress. Other Western Republicans, including Linda Smith of Washington and Steve Stockman of Texas, promoted the groups. They spoke at militia conferences. They brought militia members on as campaign volunteers. They defended militias from federal investigation. And all of these ties would come under intense scrutiny just 3 months after Chenoweth entered Congress. In April 1995, 2 men with close ties to both the militia and white power movements detonated 4,800 pounds of explosives outside the federal building in Oklahoma City, killing 168 people. For Chenoweth, the bombing was an opportunity to show she would not bow to public pressure. She continued to support the militia movement, and while she denounced the bombing, she suggested the federal government shared the blame for it. In the wake of the attack, she said, "We still must look at the public policies that are pushing people too far." And as a result, she found herself with a new national platform. She received invitations to appear on Face the Nation and the National Nightly News. She garnered mentions in all of the major newspapers. Ties to extremists led to Chenoweth's not being ignored as a fringe figure, but rather spotlighted as someone unusual, intriguing, maybe even insightful. Chenoweth leveraged that journalistic bias to great effect, becoming an increasingly influential Republican lawmaker. It's easy to see Chenoweth and the women of the IWF as a model for Republican women to follow. There are national figures like Michelle Bachmann and Sarah Palin. And frankly, because the 1990s weren't that long ago, a lot of the women who I've talked about tonight are actually still around. Plenty of the anti-feminist women who made their names in the 1990s continue to wield power today. Kellyanne Fitzpatrick, who became Kellyanne Conway after she married, became Donald Trump's campaign manager and senior advisor. Laura Ingraham is now a Fox News star. Ann Coulter is a leading figure within the nativist right. These women played a central role in pulling the Republican Party to the right and lashing it to radical movements. They shaped a new generation of right-wing punditry and helped move the party away from the Reaganism of the 1980s toward a more pessimistic, nativist, and martial politics. They are important not only because they were women doing that work, but because they manipulated gender expectations and anti-feminist politics to make their radicalism more palatable, more intriguing, and more popular. And in many ways, they built the political world we live in today. Thank you.